Which ruler halved the population of an entire country? What did the most ruthless maniacs look like? And who was feared even in Alcatraz? All the answers are right here in this episode about the most terrifying personalities of all time. This is Infinity, and today I'll show you some of the most evil people in history that will make you feel uncomfortable. Leopold II. Leopold II was king of the Belgians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but he's remembered for his terrible activities in Africa. He founded the formerly independent Congo Free State and became its personal owner for some 30 years. Despite its name, there were no freedoms in the state, and all locals were essentially the property and slaves of Leopold II, who did whatever he wanted with them. For the most part, the king of the Belgians got rid of them and did so brutally. He forced people to work to exhaustion on plantations to get money for the sale of rubber, ivory, and other riches of the Congo, and if they didn't think someone was trying hard enough, he didn't hesitate to execute or mutilate them. It wasn't uncommon for the victim to be massacred in front of their family. The atrocities of the Congo Free State during the rule of Leopold II were of apocalyptic proportions. The tyrant murdered 15 million people. The population of the Congo Free State was halved by Leopold II and was despised by the whole world during his lifetime. If Leopold II held Africa at bay, Al Capone held America at bay. The most famous gangster in history can rightly be considered one of the most evil and dangerous men of all time. In the 1920s, he operated in Chicago. At that time, the city literally belonged to him. Under the guise of a furniture business and a chain of dry cleaners, he was involved in the illegal sale of alcohol during Prohibition, as well as the gambling business. It's believed that it was Al Capone who introduced the concept of racketeering. He was also one of the first practitioners of the total extermination of competitors. He waged an entire war between criminals, which Capone won. Especially epic and brutal was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, when Capone cunningly eliminated competitors. The authorities knew of Capone's deeds, but strange as it may sound, they put him behind bars not for murder, racketeering, and illegal business, but for not paying taxes. Capone was sent to prison in Atlanta and then to the legendary Alcatraz. At that time, he was still at the height of his fame, so it's not surprising that in Alcatraz he was feared by other criminals. However, in Alcatraz, the gangster's already poor health began to deteriorate rapidly, and Al Capone spent the last year of his imprisonment in a prison hospital. After his release from the prison, the once violent gangster lived sick and weakened in seclusion in Florida. I'm sure you all know who Count Dracula is. Yes, the legendary vampire from the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. But did you know that Dracula the vampire had a prototype? Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula, was this prototype. In the 15th century, he was the ruler of Wallachia, which is now southern Romania. In general, Vlad the Impaler was officially known as Vlad the Third Basarab, but he was not called the Impaler by accident. In Romanian, it literally means impalement. This gives an idea of his favorite form of execution. Dracula would impale anyone for anything. Impalement was accepted as punishment for any crime, whether the person committed murder or stole a loaf of bread. Dracula brutally dealt with his enemies, took revenge on his offenders, burned entire villages with all the locals, got rid of all the sick and poor in his Wallachia, and held his people at bay. It's difficult even to count how many lives were ruined by this insane ruler. It's interesting, by the way, that such a cruel man was no stranger to charity. He donated money to monasteries and distributed funds for the construction of churches. We often associate the Middle Ages with the Inquisition, the execution of the witches and others who were considered heretics. There were many inquisitors in those days who carried out terrible activities, but Thomas of Torquemada was second to none. Torquemada was the cruelest inquisitor in history who ruined tens of thousands of lives. There's a theory that Torquemada's hatred of dissenters arose after his beloved girl rejected him, preferring him to the Moor. In any case, Torquemada eventually became the chief prosecutor of Jews, Moors, and other non-Catholics in Spain. In 1483, he assumed the post of Grand Inquisitor of Spain and began his rampage at full throttle. Hundreds of thousands of Jews and Moors were expelled from Spain, and tens of thousands were imprisoned where they were tortured and awaited execution. Torquemada was an advocate of public executions, and also issued his own guidelines for defining heretics. He was so tough on non-Catholics that even the Pope at the time condemned Torquemada for atrocities. But the Inquisitor didn't heed the words of the head of the church and continued his dark deeds until his death. From the Middle Ages, let's move to our time, because even in modern history, there have been many creepy people. Dorotea Puente is a perfect example. She looks like a sweet old lady, an old dawdler who must be baking cookies for her grandchildren and spending her time watching soap operas. In fact, she's a dangerous maniac with about 10 victims to her credit. Dorotea's background dates back to the 1980s. Back then, she ran a boarding house that was later dubbed the Boarding House of Death. No wonder why. Various people moved in, from which Dorotea selected alcoholics, the elderly, and the mentally retarded. She gave them cookies with a huge dose of sleeping pills, got rid of them, and then cashed their Social Security and welfare checks. Sooner or later, someone had to notice that people were checking into the boarding house and disappearing there forever, and that's what happened. In the late 80s, police raided the boarding house, and detectives uncovered the horrors Puente was making. In the end, the pretty old lady was sentenced to life in prison, and she died in 2011. Jean Bedel Bokassa, a cannibal, a dictator, a ruthless madman. All this can be said of Jean Bedel Bokassa. He was president of the Central African Republic from 1966 to 1976. This wasn't enough for him, so in 1976 he proclaimed himself emperor for life. As you understand, such a man would not handle his opponents with kid gloves. Bokassa dealt with the opposition very cruelly. Some of them he fed for dinner to crocodiles and lions. Bokassa was also a cannibal and didn't hesitate to talk about it. The emperor disliked not only his opponents, but also his own people. While his citizens were barely making ends meet and dying of poverty, Bokassa boasted of his wealth. For example, for his coronation, he wore a diamond crown worth $5 million, shoes that got into the Guinness Book of World Records as the most expensive in the world, and sat on a golden throne weighing more than 2 tons. It was as if he was making fun of his own people on purpose. Eventually, everyone got fed up, and in 1979, the tyrant was overthrown and expelled from the country in absentia. He did not appear in the Central African Republic for some years, but one day he brazenly returned, believing that the people would put him back on the throne. Of course, this didn't happen. Bokassa was instantly arrested and sentenced to death. By some miracle, Bokassa was lucky. The sentence was commuted twice, and then the tyrant was set free by an amnesty and died 3 years later in his bed from a heart attack. Joseph Mengele. The infamous Third Reich is known for many evil and horrible personalities, and Joseph Mengele is definitely one of the Reich's creepiest men. His resounding nickname, the Angel of Death, speaks well of him. Mengele was a doctor who conducted gruesome medical experiments on the prisoners of the Auschwitz concentration camp. It's difficult to describe the full range of Mengele's experiments. For example, he conducted operations to change the color of the cornea, so the doctor tried to find a way to turn people with brown and black eyes into blue-eyed Aryans. There were also experiments in gynecology, experiments with lowering body temperature to extremes and infecting people with deadly diseases. He had a special love for twins, on whom he conducted specific experiments. Some of the tasks Mengele set for himself were related to bringing humans to the standards of racial purity, while others were orders from the military. The German army needed new ways to escape hypothermia and pressure fluctuations, effective antibiotics, and innovative methods of surgery. But such needs, of course, do not justify Mengele's atrocities. The Mad Doctor had hundreds of thousands of victims to his credit. All this being said, it's surprising and unfair that he was never held accountable for his actions. After the end of World War II, Mengele fled to Latin America, where he could never be found. Heinrich Himmler. And here's another key figure of the Third Reich. Heinrich Himmler was not as strong in medicine as Mengele, but he was well-versed in agriculture. He was an agronomist by profession. However, he went down in history not as a lover of agriculture, but as one of the main monsters of all times. He was one of the main organizers of the Holocaust. Unfortunately, it was largely because of this man that millions of innocent Jews and Gypsies were gone. In addition, Himmler founded death squads, headed the Gestapo, and created and guarded concentration camps. In general, All the most terrible acts of World War II, which only can be recalled and imagined, were on his account. Unlike Mengele, Himmler still managed to be arrested soon after the end of the war. But the case didn't come to trial. While in custody, Himmler swallowed an ampule with potassium cyanide. Everyone knows Genghis Khan as the Great Conqueror. He was the founder and first Great Khan of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. He not only united the disparate Mongol and Turkic tribes, but also organized conquest campaigns, thus creating the largest continental empire in history. It stretched from the Pacific to the Danube and from Novgorod to Southeast Asia. All this sounds cool, but many people forget what Genghis Khan did for all these territories, glory and influence. Genghis Khan's campaigns were very cruel. Some of them ended not only with the capture of a city, but also with the complete elimination of its population. According to studies by scientists, Genghis Khan was indirectly and directly responsible for the death of 60 million people. To give you an idea of the scale, in the 13th century, it was from 4 to 12% of the total world population. That is, Genghis Khan literally wiped out 1/10 of the world. He was fierce in his reprisals against his enemies. For example, when the Persians killed the Mongol ambassador, Genghis Khan became enraged and exterminated most of their people. All these details should not be forgotten when recalling Genghis Khan's great deeds. That's all, guys. Which person do you personally consider to be the most evil in history? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and see you later.